Hi, welcome to the 3D Pen Den. Recently, I released a video on how to iron your 3D pen projects to achieve smooth and fun multicolored surfaces. But I ran out of time to show you a project that would demonstrate the technique. So here it is. The dragon is coming. By the way, the link to the ironing video is in the description. I recommend you watch it before trying this. You may need the specifics. In the mentioned ironing video, we talked about the 9 reasons to iron PLA. In this project, we will use at least 7 of them. Besides your pen, you will need filament in black and white and 3 other colors of your choice. And a black double-fold bias tape, which you get at any sewing store supplies. Mine is about half polyester and half cotton fabric. I'm not sure if that is important, but it could be. The next thing that is super important is the right work surface. I like to work on a sheet of plexiglass sprayed with matte acrylic coating, and I attach a clear file pocket to the bottom for easy pattern rotation. Then you will need a plan. Either you can get this PDF printable pattern from 3D Pen Den Etsy store, or you can draw your own the old-fashioned way on a graph paper. Either way, you will need to find yourself some forming tube. The Etsy pattern is made for a 1-inch tube plumbing PVC pipe. But my first dragon I just made over a paper tube from paper towels. The circumference of the tube has to match this dimension of the pattern. And the black skeleton part is double the outside diameter. So find a tube of your choice, and you can always print the pattern a few % smaller or bigger to match your particular tube. Since this is primarily an ironing project, you will need an iron and some Teflon sheets or parchment paper to protect it from sticking to the plastic. Once you get to the assembly part, you will need a wood burning tool. If you don't have one, you can just glue the whole thing together. Maybe. I haven't actually tried that, but in theory it should work. Then you will need a third hand to hold things. And if you don't have one, just get something that will do the job. This is not a project for a complete beginner, so I'm assuming that you already have some basic tools of the trade on hand in your studio. And you will need all the clips in the known universe. Now we are ready to get started. Start with the black grid. And I usually make the edges double line or even a triple line. Just simply fill the grid with the colors. Or you can do some fancy penmanship over the top. Like so. Whatever you do will affect the final look of the surface. Here is the simple fill, and here you get more gradual transition from one color to the next. Let's do the straight fill to keep things simple for the first try. The 3D Pen Den Etsy pattern has all the multiple colored parts all laid out, so you don't have to switch to a different filament color quite as often. Do all the reds in one go, all the oranges, and so on. I do work with multiple pens, but I anticipate that most people won't have that luxury. Here is the head of my first dragon, and I would like to add a word of caution here. While it is a lot of fun to have all these optional accessories like teeth and horns and ears and so on, it does make the head heavier, which affects the ease of the motion of the finished dragon. So it is entirely up to you how many of these features you feel is necessary. The only parts you really need is the basic snout and the eyes, and the rest is optional. I will go as simple as possible for this video dragon, but I do want to show you how to plan for a different color inside the mouth should you want one. And it may give him some cute freckles too. The top color will be the one inside the mouth. The double layer is a bit harder to work with, but the colors will merge a bit, giving it a slightly speckled look. And here will be his freckles. Making eyes could be a whole separate video, but let's stick with just two options. For either one of them, I will just color the eyes white for a start. Then finish his face and hair. The hair is what you attach the horns and ears to, should you decide to have them. I will also cover the back of the eyes so they don't show on the back of the head. They will still show a little, but we won't see that part much anyway. The looser and more scribbly your pen strokes are, the thinner the plastic sheet will be. And also more interesting the color merging that will result from the ironing of that part. Here is what you can expect from that kind of color blending. Of course, the part will spread with the ironing, so you will have to trim it to size, which we will address later. I am planning on giving him a textured feet, so these yellow foot shapes are a bit optional, but it will help me size them, as you will see later. This pattern is designed to make the spikes double up, to be stronger and to help both sides look more similar. But they will never be completely the same anyway, so you may decide that making just half is enough. It's less work that way, so you decide. And you don't even have to decide beforehand. Make half now and do the other side later if you do decide you need it. There is a white line on the final pattern, so you can see where the midline is. All there is left to do are these few nondescript black parts. Don't skip those. That's what makes the whole thing work. Here it says make 10, but for the dragon body you will actually only need 9. The last rectangle is there to attach the legs, unless you decide to just glue them on, in which case skip the 10th one. Here is all we need. Time to iron. Iron ironing is a relatively easy way to achieve a smooth, finished-looking surface without having to sand and paint the whole project. I usually iron on a wooden board. As you can see, it's getting a bit burned. In my ironing video, I say you can also use tile. So I will test that today to see how that works in this particular case. Sometimes the equipment can make or break a project. I also just found these white Teflon sheets, which I'm excited to try because they are so much more translucent than the brown ones. The two sides of the pieces already look quite different. The side that is immediately touching the iron will distort more, so put the side you are planning to use on the bottom. Set your iron on as high as it will go and move it as little as possible. I set my timer for 2 minutes, but you may need different time depending on your equipment. Never ever walk away from it. That could be a fire hazard. If you do get accidentally distracted, the timer is there to scream at you in 2 minutes. Some irons are designed for safety to switch off if not moved constantly, so you may need to stay there anyway and move it just slightly. After the 2 minutes, check it against the light source. If there are any holes still visible, keep ironing. Now, for a quick review, the white Teflon sheets are a bit more porous than the brown ones, and some of the plastic got through the mesh onto my iron. So I had to put a parchment sheet on both sides to keep the plastic from messing up my iron. Also, by the way, it took way longer to iron on the tile than on the wood, because the marble is cooling it too much. I eventually switched to a ceramic tile and preheated it, and then it worked and way better. Just keep in mind that equipment matters. I personally am going back to my board for the rest of this video. After a while, check again, and when the holes are all gone, you are done. Here's the other side. Now we need to stick it between two cold tiles to get it to release from the sheet. You can also just wait until it cools down, but I am always too eager to see the results. Plus, the tiles keep it from warping during the cooling process. Here we go. Now do this to the rest of them. Now that the surface is finished, we need to get the size back under control. If you compare the ironed pieces with the original size, you will see that all the parts have spread ever so slightly. It's time to use the part of the pattern that we didn't trace, this white one. I will cut it out, for this will be our pattern to cut the body parts into the right shape. This shape is what will allow our dragon to wiggle. Like so. It's helpful to bend it on the dotted line, so you can use it as a registration line to put the bend in the middle, right through the central line of the white diamonds, so everything stays centered. Trace it with something you will be able to see and cut it out. This is not super great for your scissors, so don't use your best sewing scissors for this. Fiskars scissors are nice and sturdy, and you can get sharpeners for them to keep them in working order. Also, metal sheet scissors might be an option. You don't really need to sand these much, but take off any sharp edges or corners. Here we go, all 8 of them. Ideally all the same size. Now we will need to get back to the original size on all the other pieces And the beauty of the printable pattern is that you can print another copy to cut up for patterns and still keep your tracing pattern intact in case you need to redo any part. We will need 9 of these, all the same size. When you cut the pattern for the first headpiece, you may need to bend a registration line where the orange part meets the first body segment. That will give you a chance to align and trace the front, and then the back line will need to be cut with the body segment pattern, so it will have the same slants as the rest of the body parts. On the face part of the head, you really need to only worry about the bottom curve being the right shape. The hair you can improvise on depending how it deformed during the ironing and cut it just so it looks good. Doesn't have to be precise. Now, while the face is still flat, it may be a good time for the eyes. You can either iron them on, as I have done in the ironing video, or you can just draw them on with a permanent marker, which is what I'm going to do for this video, because I want to try to make the head as light as possible to see if it will make a difference in the movement of the creature. If you get the plastic thin enough, it will cut even with detailing scissors, which you may need to use for the smaller shapes. Hold on to the tail pattern, we will need it later in the tail forming stages. Last but not the least, the spine. If you made both halves of the spine, you will need to cut it in the middle. Put it on top of each other, the wrong sides together, and fuse it with the iron. Before the final trim. All flat parts are done. Now we are finally ready to jump into the third dimension. Still remember the forming tube I was talking about? Clip it to the surface because you will need all the hands you have got. And please protect them with gloves. If you watched the ironing video, you know that the trick to this is to iron it just enough for the plastic to stick to the top sheet, but not yet to the bottom sheet. So we can still pick it up. Which makes me think that perhaps here it would be better to use a cold tile on the bottom to avoid heating up the bottom too much. You can try that. Hold it there till it solidifies. Or you can even clip it on for a while till it's really cold. Here we go. Alternatively, you can also shape these with hot water, like in the bracelet video, if you find the hot water forming process easier. Now we will repeat the process with the head tube. Make sure you align the edges well. Oops, here I over-trimmed it a little bit, but I think it will still close. Anyway, it will give me a chance to show you how to deal with something like this later. Forming of the face part is a little challenging because you can't wrap it tight around the tube, just the bottom. And the top you have to hold to get a good face angle. This one is good to form with the white Teflon sheet or the parchment paper because you can see more easily through it to look at what you're doing. Last, the tail. It is possible to form cones freehand, but it's not easy. So tape your tail paper pattern into a cone, cover it with masking tape, and stabilize it somehow. Then you have just the right size of cone and both hands to form it with. Here we go. You may have to slide it up the cone a bit because the masking tape made things a hair bigger, but it will still fit. Now all we have left to do is put it all together and we have a dragon. Remember the bias tape I talked about in the beginning? That's what makes the movement possible. Now's the time for it. Bias tape is a piece of fabric cut diagonally to make it super flexible. It's used to finish off edges, that's why it comes pre-folded like this. But we won't need the folds, just a flat bias strip that is bigger than the longer side of our black rectangles, which is about 3 inches. It can be wider than that. We are going to trim it anyway. Let's cut about 20 inches of it and look at how this is going to work. I am planning to iron these rectangles onto the tape with tiny, precisely spaced gaps in between them, which is the hard part. Because if you make the rectangles spread and fuse together, you will ruin the joints. It took a while for me to solve this one. If you just glue it on, it makes the joint brittle. You are welcome to do it differently, but this is how I finally solved it. First, iron out all the previous folding from the tape. And put your ironing board on something to create a step and work over that edge. This will help to keep things straight and keep the previous piece out of the way of the iron. This process is challenging in terms of precision, so take your time. And don't forget to use your cooling tile to get the Teflon to release from the plastic. Now, move that to the edge and fold it out of the way, but keep the gap as small as possible so it goes over the right angle and stays out of the way of the iron. After each addition, check if the joint works before you move to the next segment. Be consistent about it to keep all the joints the same size and as straight as possible. Here we have all 9 of them on. 8 for the body and 1 for the head. Now it's time to play with it to check if it's all stuck on safely. I know you can't see a thing on the black background. Here, in fact, enjoy playing with it. It will never work quite this elegantly again because every next addition will compromise the movement a little bit. But it will look better. Now we will trim it straight and cut it in the middle. fabric sides together and clip it in place. Test if it still moves, and then iron the two black long tail parts to the last segment, one side at a time. Trim off the excess fabric and test it again. The tail will be the handle of our dragon, so there is no joint between the slanted part of the tail and the last segment. That part is solid. Time to join things together, which you can do either by just simply melting the edges with your wood burning tool, or if you want things super clean, just micro iron the squares together over a piece of Teflon sheet or parchment. That is a little fussier, but it produces way cleaner and smoother edges. Join only one side of the squares, but both slants of the tail. The slit on the other side of the squares is where the spikes will go, so don't close that yet. Cut up the spikes in units of 2 and clip them in to see if they match the size of the squares and don't get in the way of the joints. If they do, trim them a little. Start joining at the tail side, that way you don't accidentally attach spikes to the first segment. That one doesn't get any because that's where the head will go. Now we will solder the spikes to the squares on both sides. I am still trying to decide which tip is best for this soldering job. So you will see me using different tips throughout this video. You may have to test your tips on scraps to see what will work for you from the ones that came with your tool. Check out the joints again to make sure they all still work. Remember I over-trimmed the head tube a little? Don't do that. But I think this gap will still close as the plastic spreads in the ironing. I can't put a tile on this to release it, so I just rub it with a cold metal tool to remove the Teflon sheet faster. If you still have holes, keep going until you are happy with the surface. This gap will close when I'm attaching the head to the skeleton square. For closing the tail, I will need my forming cone again. And I will stuff it with something, like aluminum foil, for example, so it will hold up better to the pressure of the tools. It's a bit flimsy because, remember, it's just your paper pattern covered with tape. Here I'm testing a round tip because I feel the leaf tip makes too much of a flat spot on the side of the round cone shape, especially on the skinny part. For the same reason, I also switched to a round release tool. Now, before we join the two head pieces together, you will have to decide if you want any of the other optional accessories on your dragon head, like teeth and horns and ears and such, because it's a good idea to add those before you join the two head parts together. But for this dragon, I am trying to lighten up the head, so I will skip all that for the moment. We will deal with all those optionals in the last part of this video. For joining the two main headpieces, it is a good idea to test it out first, and then make some registration marks where the parts need to come together. And then just fuse it, either straight up or over a Teflon sheet if you want it cleaner. But under the chin it won't show a whole lot. Looks like we are close to the final assembly here. But I know what you're thinking. What about the leg segments? As you may recall, I said I wanted to make the feet textured. Make sure you put them on going in the right direction. The bend of the leg needs to point backwards from the direction of the toes. I will use the little yellow feet as a size guide and work over them. And give him some claws. Dragons need those. And back ones too. There are two options of how you can attach the legs to the body segments. Either you make that 10th black optional rectangle and cut it up lengthwise into 4 strips, and then use that to micro iron the legs onto the segments, like so. But it's a bit fussy and adds more unnecessary weight. So I will use the option number 2 and just glue the legs on this time. Now the dragon is finally ready to come together. Head, 2 neck segments, legs, 2 body segments, legs again, 2 tail segments, and the tail tip. I will start by attaching the head first. Remember that little black dot? That is going to help hold the head in place. And also, this is the part you attach the tongue to if you decide to have one. I strongly recommend to find and mark the middle, because here I didn't, and then I fused it on off-center, which made it hard to get it into the head tube. Fortunately, it still fits, but doing it right the first time saves time. Now I will just fuse the bottom of the head square into that little gap I had there, and that will hold the head in place. If not, you still have enough access to add some more plastic inside with your pen. The next thing that has to be attached is the tip of the tail, because that has to go on while you still can get to it. With any of the segments, you can just reach in with your pen and put a bead of plastic into the tube on either side of the central black square. And if it looks like it's not holding it well enough, organize it a bit with the soldering tool. Once the bottom of the square is attached to the center of the tube, you also seal the top edges of the tube to both sides of the spikes. And then move on to the next segment. As always, test each new addition for ease of movement. And if you find you just put some plastic in the way, snip it off. And keep going till you have all the segments done. Alternatively, you can just glue the parts on, but I don't find that to be any easier. In fact, it takes a bit longer because you need to wait for each segment to dry. And we have a dragon. I have to say, this one, which is the second one I made, moves a lot easier than my first one. Which could be because the head is lighter, or because I paid a lot more attention to not hindering the movement. I tested it after every stage, which I neglected to do the first time around. So, what about the teeth and horns and all the other fun optional parts? You can skip them and still have a dragon, but if you feel dragon without teeth is not a dragon, then the time to add any extra parts would be before you join the two head parts together. First, trace all the parts you are planning to use, and don't forget you will need 2 jaws. As with all the previous parts, iron them and trim them back to the original size. Some parts will tell you to mark the middles, so do that. Now we need to shape the jaws to conform to the inside of the head tube. The hot water forming process is better for this. You don't want them to get so hot they will stick to the head tube. Not yet. We need to do a few other things to them first. When you cut the teeth back to size after the ironing step, just cut the top and sides. The actual teeth are best cut after they are already attached to the jaws. Then we'll shape the teeth so they fit the curve of the jaw. Like so. Now we are ready to make him cute little dentures. We will fuse it together, starting with the centering marks, so they don't go on lopsided. The top may get a bit messy, but that part won't show anyway, so don't worry about it. You can always clean up the parts that will show if you need to. Then mark where the teeth go. It's helpful to clip the pattern onto the teeth for this. And cut them out. I find the short cutting pliers are just the right size for this step. And having the teeth already attached to the jaw gives you a chance to cut almost to the jaw for longer and sharper teeth. Make sure you cut off all the pencil marks too. Now we'll repeat with the other jaw. Here the pencil marks are not as important as that the fangs point straight down. So alter the pencil marks if you have to. And we are ready to try them on to see how they fit him, how far forward you want them and such. Make sure they are centered. And then just glue them in. Trim any extra plastic off and clean up after this step. Also, keep in mind you just made the inside diameter of the head tube a bit smaller by the addition of the jaws. So you may have to trim the head segment of the black square that goes in it, and also the dot that goes on the end of it, so it fits again. Now, after this adventure, if you are ready for more, let's tackle the horns. Eastern dragons seem to have kind of antlers rather than horns. If you choose to do those, you may also need the extra hair part on the pattern. And as usual, you have options. You can either iron them and cut them out like any of the other parts, or you can bake them to keep them more 3D and glossy, so they stand out a bit among the flat and matte finish of the hair. If you choose the baking option, refer to the baking video in the description on those details. I am not sure if you can tell from the video, but they do have quite a different look. Again, it's up to you. Next, we'll have to make room for them in the hairpiece. I am going to cut it all the way to the orange face part in the 2 spots where the horns will go. And while I'm at it, I will also make openings for the ears on the sides of the head at about eye level. Planning to tuck the horns behind the central 3 hairs, so I need to bend them out of the way. Another good way of forming is with hot steam. I don't want to soften the whole face anymore, so I don't want to dunk the whole thing in hot water. I just want to strategically soften it in the place where I want it to bend. And you probably saw people online doing this with flame, but this is a bit less intimidating since you can't overmelt it so easily. So take your time to style his hair a bit while you are at it. This is how they will go on, and we will fuse them on right here. As always, try to stabilize the pieces as best as you can. It will make your life easier. And go for it. You want to attach them well. That is way more important than if it's super clean. If it makes a mess, we have the extra hair to hide it with, remember? Make sure you clean your heat tool often, so you don't have any burnt plastic on it. And since we already cut those slits for the ears, let's make those next. I traced them in the two colors and covered them with orange so the red doesn't show on the back of the ears. However, once you iron it, it will probably still show. So you can put another layer of orange on at that point, if you care, and iron it again before you trim them to size. Now here I am finally happy with the color of both sides. So let's shape them. I told you it will be an adventure. This is actually the easy and fun part. Just soften it on a piece of Teflon sheet or parchment and squeeze. Wear gloves for this. The Teflon sheet gets quite hot. The attaching is a little trickier. I will make some more room with my heat tool right here and stick it right on. However, this may not be super safely attached yet. So let's put some more plastic in the back where it won't show as much. And possibly reorganize that a bit with the heat tool. Repeat it on the other side, and then we will put that extra hairpiece on to mask any mess we might have made with attaching the horns. Now it could be the time to join the two parts of the head. And you already know how to do that. Right here. Are you sure you also want the tongue? Of course you do. So pan it, iron it, trim it, and this is the black dot it will get mounted on. This may take some planning. The dot will eventually go inside the head somewhere about where the orange meets the pattern part. So decide how long you want it and where it needs to get attached to the dot so it sticks out just right. We'll make a little attaching tab at the end of the tongue. I find that scoring with the heat tool is the cleanest way to make good corners. Just use light touch with your heat tool. You want it to soften along the bend line but not cut it off. And then bend it. Mount the dot on the body skeleton first. Once you have the tongue on it, it will be in the way and you won't be able to do this ironing on trick anymore. Also a word of caution. Now that you have the jaws with the teeth inside the head tube, there will be a lot less room, so you may have to trim the black dot smaller, but I already mentioned that. In fact, you may have to trim the first black square too, to fit it inside the head tube. Attach the tongue at your premeditated location on the dot. And check if the whole thing still fits into the head. The eyebrows give him personality. If you glue them higher, he will be more surprised. If you glue them lower, he will be meaner. You can invert them or even use them as whiskers. Play with it. Try different placements with stick-on putty, and then when you are happy, glue them on permanently. Now, why does my dragon have a scaly nose? That was a troubleshooting measure. I welded the face seam too, which ended up looking rather messy, straight in the middle of his face. So this was a good strategy to hide it. which is what you can do right here if your seam is not the cleanest on the planet. Or you can make another extra hairpiece and stick it right here to give him a little beard and hide the mess. And you are done. Time to play with it. We did cover a lot of ironing and other heat processing in this video. It's a bit challenging project, so take it slow. Took me almost an hour to just explain it. So let me know in the comments if you still have questions. And until next time, go and make a dragon.